Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started shortly. Before we begin, here's how to earn CPE credit. Unlike traditional CPE webinars, there are no polling questions or attendance checks during the presentation. Instead, you will demonstrate your knowledge by taking a brief multiple-choice quiz in the Earmark app. Search for the free Earmark app from the App Store or Google Play Store, or scan the QR code on the screen. Open the app and create an account. Be sure to use a valid email address because we'll email you your CPE certificates. From the home screen, scroll down to find the course. You can also tap the magnifying glass icon to search for the course. Tap on the course artwork, then the Enroll button. On the Course tab, you'll find the recording and quiz questions. If you don't see the quiz yet, don't worry. We'll email you when the quiz is available. Complete the quiz to earn your CPE certificate. If you have questions or need help, email us anytime at support@earmarkcpe.com. Now, on to the webinar.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Spreadsheet, Real-World Budget Enforcement Challenges and Solutions. And I'm just going to get this going and hand it off to your hosts and presenters today, Chris Wallace and Erwin Jacobson. So please, both of you, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome. So super excited to have everyone here today. Obviously going to be talking about kind of the real world budget enforcement challenges and solutions today. And so I'm actually going to get us into some introductions here momentarily. But as we get into the conversation today, I want to get us in the frame of mind of, us as accountants and finance individuals. You've meticulously planned your company's budget, and you really think that that's the end of it, right? That's the hard part is over. Well, not necessarily, right? So the true test lies at the end of the day enforcing that budget, kind of kicking it out of the nest once it's finalized. And really now this is where we start to unpack the often overlooked struggles in the budget enforcement stage. And so I'll also kind of refer to that as more or less operationalizing one's budget. So operationalizing that budget for the business to leverage. So this session is tailor-made for those who've crossed that planning phase and are now facing the real-world challenges of ensuring budget compliance and accountability throughout their entire organization. So as I mentioned, operationalizing one's budget is not only enforcement. Of course, that's part of it, but it is about empowering your stakeholders with the right tools and the right information to be accountable for owning that budget throughout the year. And that's certainly going to be a lot of what we talk about today. And I'm going to briefly talk about our agenda and then get into some introductions. And so today, through today's webinar, we're going to be able to go through a lot of the essential challenges in that budget enforcement that I've alluded to a little bit. A lot of the key pitfalls that we find ourselves kind of falling into throughout the year as we manage that budget on a month-by-month basis. And certainly some strategies for adapting the budgets to the changing business environments that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, how do we remedy those? Actionable solutions and best practices from myself and my co-host here today, Erwin. So I'm going to introduce myself really quickly. Chris Wallace. I'm a solution engineer at Payam Software. I've been in the solution engineering space for a little over 6 years at this point. I did, however, start my career actually and spent nearly, a decade, almost eight or 9 years in corporate finance, FP&A, accounting, specifically managing these types of processes and these budgets in the shoes of those roles. And then working with hundreds, if not thousands of prospects in my last 6 years, gathering a lot of different perspectives, working with, prospects and customers such as Erwin, in solutioning a lot of these and providing best practices in this space. So I am going to turn it over to Erwin, who actually happens to be one of our valued customers with Payam as well. So Erwin, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Erwin Jacobson, and I am the Chief Financial Officer here at Blue Digital Group. We're an entertainment technology and services company. I'm a certified public accountant in California. I have been in financial positions within mostly entertainment companies for the majority of my career. I started off at Deloitte & Touche back when, which is Deloitte now, of course. and did my stint there as a public accountant, and then got into the entertainment industry and have just moved from a couple of companies to companies over the last couple of years. In all of those roles, whether it was as a accounting manager, controller, a VP, a CFO, there's always budgeting and forecasting involved in what we do. And so hope to be able to share quite a bit of insight and some stories about the topic today.
Thanks, Erwin. Yeah, we put a lot of time in preparing for, obviously, for this webinar today. And I want to, before we kind of dive into things, I wanted to be sure to mention that this is obviously a live webinar. So we're going to take on a little bit of, Erwin and I, more or less a podcast format. And so we'd love to answer questions as they arise, from the audience, from our live audience today. So if you would like to, I already see someone commenting there on the comment section. Please feel free to use that comment on the right, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on that and answer them during today's conversation, if possible. And we certainly have allocated some time at the end as well for Q&A. So we will be sure to make sure we can answer any of those questions as they arise. So without further ado, let's actually jump into our first discussion point today, right? So some of the key challenges that we're going to experience as finance and accounting professionals whenever it comes to operationalizing that budget. So I want us to get in the frame of mind that, right, it's January, it's the beginning of the year, speaking for our calendar year folks, our budget is most likely finalized and has been more or less kicked out of the nest, right? And hopefully it's sinking or swimming, right? Most likely swimming. But today we are going to focus on that next stage of our budget evolution and how we operationalize and enforce that budget now that it is actually out of our hands, per se, and in the hands of the business. And in doing so, whenever Erwin and I were kind of preparing for this conversation, one of the main topics that really arose initially as a pretty large pain point in this space is just the lack of visibility as it relates to getting actionable information in the hands of those budget owners so that they can make informed, readily timely decision making, right? So I know specifically from my experience, there was a cadence. We had a close process, close day plus 7 or 8. We'd have reports that I would email out to the folks, and it might have a simple budget versus actuals analysis and a P&L in there, and that would possibly be the information that they got. And I think key point there is they're not getting that data that I just presented them until a quarter of the next month is already behind them, right? So this is where we start to talk about ensuring that we're managing these processes effectively and getting them visibility in real time. So I know, Erwin, I'd like to kind of get you involved in this part of the conversation because this is certainly something that we talked in great length about. But what are some of those, pitfalls and challenges that you've seen on the lack of visibility standpoint as it relates to your experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Chris. I mean, you got to remember that for most of us, we are working with non-accountants. We're not working with people who understand the numbers the way that we do. They're not dealing with it day to day. They're operationalizing what they're doing, and the numbers are more of an annoyance. Budgets are problematic for them. They're restrictive, and they don't want to adhere to it or have Big Brother watching, but at the same time, they know that those are the rules. So you have to be able to get the data to your customers, your internal customers, the operations folks or whoever, depending on the type of company that you work in a meaningful way to them, not accountant speak, but more in the method or in the presentation wise that they can understand it. It has to be usable to the user, to the end user. And that becomes a real challenge because a lot of us are very left brain kind of thinking accountants, the old green eye shade kind of basic accountant who thinks very linearly. And we find often that the operational people are more right brain, they're more creative, they don't think in terms of numbers, and they don't necessarily understand how what we're presenting makes sense to them. So it can be a challenge to present information to the end users, the stakeholders, in a way that is meaningful to them translating what's meaningful to us into their speak.
Yeah, 100% agree. And actually, you'll see this as a kind of a common theme throughout today's discussion. Everything that we're talking about is an intertwined web of commonality and connectivity. And we're going to allude to some of the reporting aspects here in a minute as well, and some of the differences in our backgrounds and training, et cetera, which, as Erwin alluded to, just dealing with different personalities, right? And kind of somewhat segueing into some of the disconnectedness that we're seeing, especially in our virtual environment that a lot of us are living in these days in the last couple of years, further adding a larger wedge into the team aspect that we need and we rely on to be able to effectively work as one. And that's kind of segueing into the next section here, being, speaking to my computer screen today, of course, I'd love to be in person with all of you, but this is just the nature of the environment that we're in today. Certainly another, challenge that we experience that certainly makes things a little bit more difficult. Everyone has different priorities. Everyone is busy at different times of the month, et cetera. And I wanted to kind of open up this last bullet here on tracking that committed spend. We'll talk here in a moment. Erwin alluded to this in our conversations about, what's tracked, what's reported, et cetera. But in my experience, in the budget versus actual view, we're really only seeing a small fraction of all the information that would actually need to be required to make informed decisions, i.e. our committed spend, right? So if I was to then go pull a budget versus actuals P&L for my business owner, they aren't really getting the full picture. And so this is certainly one of the big problem areas that I've seen in my experience, at least, that doesn't give them line of sight into dollars that are earmarked to be spent. So we're gonna get into cash versus expense views and those types of things. But having a centralized space for our budget owners to not only see what has been spent and what we expected to spend, but also what is already spoken for, giving them more visibility into knowing that these dollars are untouchable. They are allocated and will be spent. And then we'll also talk in a little bit more detail processes that are even in the request phase. So they're not even necessarily committed, but they could be. These are all areas that, without a centralized request platform to be able to understand these budget components, it can be very difficult to understand all the different pieces of the budget puzzle to have a clear, concise picture. So, just kind of curious there, Erwin, before jumping into the next stage, if there were any kind of comments that you had on providing those stakeholders with more or less more data than just our budget versus actuals view.
Yeah, one of the things that is a challenge is that, a budget is ultimately a set of assumptions created at a certain point in time. And typically what happens in my experience is by the time the ink is dry on the page, if you will, the budget is already outdated. And so it's critical to continuously reforecast in a lot of cases what your expenses are and what your revenue projections are and your variable costs. And we, at our company, we have a continuous forecasting process. The bigger the company, sometimes you find quarterly updates or semi-annual updates, or some places you have to do weekly updates. It really depends on the size of it. And so keeping your stakeholders informed of what's happening is very critical. From the managing your budget as a fixed amount of spend or a target if you're a salesperson on the revenue side, if you look at it as just a one-time calculation that's maybe done in the fall for the coming year, you're likely to fall off a cliff because things never happen the way that you say they do, or that you predict that they're going to. A lot of things get in the way. So it's very important that tracking not only be provided, but you're getting bilateral information. You're getting insight from the stakeholders as to what's changing, and then you're processing those changes and getting them those updated numbers. We typically report actuals against budget as well as forecast, because again, that budget was as of a point in time, and the forecast is more updated information. I think that it's important that, again, with the stakeholders seeing it in a way that can make sense for them, if you think about a budget as a like a holiday fund. You know, going back in the years, they used to have little Christmas funds at the bank when our parents were young, and they would have a certain amount of money that they would build up to in their savings account, and then they'd be able to spend it at the holiday times. If you look at your budget as this is a fixed amount, and once I spend it, I'm out of it, I don't think that's very practical in the real world sense of things. However, if you're trying to control costs and have them work within guidelines, that at least gives them something to work towards. If you have a travel and entertainment budget, for example, of let's say $10,000 for the quarter, and you have a big event on the 2nd of January and you spend $9,800, well, then are you screwed for the rest of the quarter? You don't have any more spending left to go, but you need to know that you already spent that. One of the challenges you run up against is you may have incurred that expense. Maybe you charged it on a credit card. Maybe you booked the reservation. It hasn't, as Chris said, it hasn't already hit the books. It hasn't been spent. It doesn't show up, but it is committed already. So you need some kind of method to be able to track not only things that have been expensed, that have been paid for, that have been charged, but also those commitments that are out there, so that you don't end up overspending without communicating what it is that's available and make adjustments if necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely love that. I mean, it's that alludes to some of the coming slides of providing, adapting to the ever-changing environment of the business that we're experiencing. So certainly on point with a lot of the discussions that we're going to have continuing as well. And I want to switch gears a little bit, not necessarily changing gears, but jumping to the next slide as it relates to some of the pitfalls that we as finance and accounting folks experience as we operationalize, as we manage that budget going throughout the year, right? So, Erwin alluded to right brain, left brain, linear versus creative, some of these things that we've experienced working with our cohorts around the business, coming down to simple things like just education, training, helping them out in understanding what it is that we're presenting them. We all have different backgrounds. Highly unlikely that they have taken the accounting 101 and the explicit CPA degrees that we all have to basically understand what it is that we're presenting them, right? And so this all doubles down on communication gaps and issues that we might have in collaborating with one another. So I've used this analogy quite a bit in my career and have fallen prey to it myself with kind of, finance being the no police from time to time. And I hated that, right? That is not a part of the role that I wanted to be portrayed as or portray around the organization. I wanted to be a trusted advisor. And I think that some of the pitfalls, this is where we kind of open the door to some of the soft skills that we experience in managing our budget throughout the year with the business, is ensuring that we have an open line of communication and collaboration with these stakeholders so that we can, remedy any sort of questions or issues that they might have. In Erwin's example, they might think that they still have the budget because, alluding to the very last bullet on the screen, we in accounting have expensed a $12,000 contract over the year, but the cash impact occurred at the very beginning when that contract was signed. So these are some prime examples where someone in the business might see that, it's February, only $1,000 of my $12,000 have been spent. I don't understand that. I thought we bought that already. They might think that they have $11,000 available, right? So these are prime learning experiences that we can work with and be trusted advisors to those stakeholders in the business to ensure that they're aware of what it is that we're putting in front of them. And I think this is going to open up some really cool conversation, because this is something that Erwin really touched on, and the lack of ownership, right? Both sides of the coin here, right? So as this is something that I'm kind of quoting Erwin on a little bit is if you don't track something, and then you can't necessarily report on that, and if you don't report on that, then how can I expect to hold someone accountable to that information? So Erwin, curious for you to add a little bit of context there and kind of dive a little bit deeper on some of that, the ownership functionality. And I know you mentioned the bottom up build of a budget, et cetera. So just kind of curious on some of your take there.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. That is a basic precept. So you've got to have details, you've got to track it, and you can't expect that the stakeholders can do anything unless they have that information. The approach that I've always taken is to be a part of the organization. So I never wanted to be, in all the companies that I worked for, I never wanted to be quote unquote corporate. I didn't want to be up in a tower somewhere looking down on, and no offense to those people who are in corporate accounting. I just didn't want to be a part of that. I wanted to be a part of operations. I wanted to be integral to the operations as a team member. So I wanted finance to be as important to the operation as the assembly line or the marketing person or the salesperson, that it's a holistic view. Excuse me. And so I think that it's very valuable to the accountant in whatever organization you're in, and even in a corporate environment, because you would have clients that might be other corporate people as well. If you can understand where they're coming from, what their needs are, and communicate in a way in which they can understand what it is that you're trying to convey, then you can get a much better meeting of the minds. So when we do budgets, we don't sit there and calculate it out and say, here's your budget. We sit down with the stakeholders and ask the questions, and then just basically help compile the data in a way that makes sense, and ask those probing questions, try to get the information, maybe provide the historical actuals, talk about who the vendors are, look and see the trends and say, well, we've seen this happen over the last 6 months, or each month it seems that this vendor is here, but I've seen this going down, or this cost has been increasing. Understand the story behind it, get them to explain it, who it is. And in those conversations, you might actually end up with identifying opportunities to perhaps save some money, maybe consolidate vendors, maybe look for opportunities based on your own experience or what they're saying, to find ways to streamline or to get better information to provide to them. And also ask a lot of questions. So as you're pulling information or pushing information to them and giving them reports, ask the questions. Sometimes it's good to ask a question that you think you already know the answer to anyway, to engage and make sure it reaffirms that the information that you're assuming is right. It gets them collaborating with you, and it also can perhaps lead to further conversations and certainly enhance the understanding mutually between the accounting department and the operating department that you're servicing with. So when you're dealing with people who are not accountants, or even people who are accountants, it's important to try and establish that connection and speak in a language that they can understand. And at the same time, you want to understand what they're saying as well. So you're not just crunching numbers and, 2 + 2 does not always equal 4. You need to understand what it is that's in those twos to figure out what the right answer is.
100% agree. And I love that. It just kind of doubles down on the soft skills that are very integral in this entire slide and this entire conversation, this entire role, ensuring that, we don't always make the assumption that they know, what it is that we're presenting them, that we ask those leading questions, those thought-provoking questions that kind of really lift the curtain, right? So that we can understand exactly anything and everything that could potentially occur as we're building that budget and as we're moving forward with that. And quite honestly, I think that's a really good segue into the next conversation as it relates to, it really resonated with me whenever Erwin was saying how, basically as soon as that ink is dried on the budget, as soon as we've submitted to the board or we've gotten final approval from the C-suite, it's outdated, right? And I can wholeheartedly say that I've lived that for sure. And so this is where it becomes extremely important to have processes in place that allow for us, like Erwin had mentioned, is, it might not be completely exhaustive. That budget might not be completely gone if we've alleviated it, because things have potentially changed in the organization. I know in my experience with some of those flexible budget strategies, we not only had just the budget versus actuals view, but very similarly to like what Erwin was alluding to, we managed a monthly 12-month rolling forecast. So that forecast month over month became more and more relevant as more changes had occurred in the business. So that is where having that comparison of those three factors made it extremely beneficial for us to know where we started, what we expected when we started this year, how we're actually trending against that, and then also taking into account the ever-changing business environment that we live in. So those are some of those components to make sure that we're constantly staying abreast of the changes. And then I really think that it's imperative upon me to really stress the timely and accurate reporting. Kind of going back to that point earlier, of accountability. If I don't do my job, if I don't present accurate and timely data, how can I expect the business to ultimately perform with that information and be successful? I think that it's extremely important to be aware of the impact of delayed or inaccurate financial reporting. Kind of going back to my cash versus expense scenario, my example. If the business thinks that they still have $11,000 left for the rest of the year and they go spend that on something when in actuality it was already spent from a cash perspective, we've now possibly doubled down on what we had allocated for that budget perspective. So it can very easily run awry if we don't make sure that we have accurate and timely information presented to those folks. So I know Erwin really mentioned and kind of piquing his memory a little bit, speaking about how can I expect someone to be able to do their job effectively if I haven't already done mine correctly and provided them with that correct information. So yeah, Erwin, I wanted to kind of challenge you to speak about that a little bit, because I know you had mentioned that in good detail in preparing our conversation for this webinar today.
Yeah, let's use the entertainment industry that I work in as an example. It's a prime example and relevant today. So here we are at the beginning of 2024. At the beginning of 2023, coming off of an amazing 2022 year where the streaming platforms were going like gangbusters. You had Max and Amazon and Netflix, and there's just the proliferation of content out there because of the pandemic and the demand being so high. We were kind of coming off of that peak, and all of the streaming companies decided that, we're not making so much money. We've got all these eyeballs on our content, but we're certainly not making money. We need to kind of put the brakes on and figure out how to do this more profitably. And then just as they started talking about that at the beginning of 2023, then the writers went on strike in Hollywood. And then a couple months later, the actors went on strike. And so for almost the entire year of 2023, the entertainment industry was at a standstill. It was just disastrous for entertainment industry companies and those servicing those companies. There were massive layoffs, not only in the studios and the streamers, but also all the ancillary kind of companies like costumers and food preparation people and everybody else, like our company that does work on the post-production side. And it had just a terrible global effect on businesses. And if we had stuck to our original budget prepared at the end of 2022 for all of 2023 and had not reforecast, we would be sunk. A lot of companies like ours had to completely adjust what we were doing. We had to think, okay, the revenues are no longer there. What are we going to do on the cost side? Because you can't keep spending at the standard level when your revenues are starting to go down, because you'll quickly be underwater. And people lived on reserves, and people who aren't working ended up not having paychecks coming through. And so companies have to adjust. And we had to look at headcount, and we had to look at spending, and we had to look at discretionary spending. And so all those things that maybe we paid for in advance, we had to look at, could we get refunds? Could we put things on hold, defer them till later? And we had to speak with the stakeholders about curtailing their spend and being smart about what the spending is, and looking at productivity of individuals, particularly when in the face of declining revenues. And so you have to be flexible and adaptable. That's where in exceptionally successful times and exceptionally unsuccessful times, the accountants can really make a difference by getting in there and explaining what the impact of that is. And Chris, you make a really good point about understanding what those commitments are, the spent and committed side, not just what's come through. Because again, dealing with non-accounting people, even if you give them reports, they may look at that and go, oh, good, I still have this much left to spend. But you need to give them that information that says, oh, we already spent all of the insurance money. We're just accounting speak. We're spreading it over the year. But yeah, we're not going out and buying any more insurance policies. We already spent that. We go to Costco, simple example, and we buy a gigantic case of coffee and forks and spoons. We don't actually go and buy coffee every single month. It wouldn't be practical. We can get a better deal by buying in bulk. And the same can apply depending on what industry you're in and what you're spending, whether it's overhead or whether it's operational expenses. We all look for deals and look for ways to maximize our spending and get the best value for our buck that we can. As accountants, we have to not only amortize those costs, spread them right, do the generally accepted accounting principle kind of application of the expenses, but we have to find a way to explain it so that we're not just handing out a report. Cash is really a challenge in cash reporting because we tend to think of financial statements on a GAAP basis. We think about accruals. And so we're looking at a financial statement and it says, oh, we had X amount of revenue this month. Well, we know that that includes what's been invoiced. And then on top of that, it's what we're accruing that hasn't been invoiced yet. And there's probably a reversal of accruals that were done the previous month. So what you're seeing in an income statement as revenue is not necessarily going to translate into cash. And yet we're paying payroll every month, every 2 weeks, every week, depending on your setup. So cash is going out the door, but your collections might be 30, 60, 90 days out from when you actually invoice it. And in fact, some of your revenue isn't even invoiced yet, it's accrued. That is a concept that is very difficult to explain to people who are not in finance. I am struggling with that now at work every day, especially having gone through 2023 and the entertainment industry pandemic. This has been a real challenge to try to explain to our board why we can show this amount of revenue, but it's not translating into cash coming in the door, and yet cash is still going out the door. That's a hard thing to do, and the challenge for those who want to be successful is finding a way to translate that information to the stakeholders in a way that they can understand it. And maybe it means showing two different presentations. Here's our GAAP basis financial statements. That's for bankers, investors, fiduciaries. Then there's the cash basis, which ERPs are not necessarily set up to report that way. So there's a lot of manual calculations that have to be done. But to the day-to-day operational people, typically the cash reporting is much more valuable to them than the GAAP basis. So you have to bridge that and figure out what makes sense in your particular situation.
Yeah, 100%, Erwin. I mean, that opened so many amazing conversation points. Just really doubling down on a lot of what we've talked about thus far. Just really ensuring that we are in tune with one another. We are a team player. We're communicating. We're collaborating with each other, and just constantly staying in tune with what's happening on the business side, and ensuring that we know how that impacts. Well, it's completely changed our outlook for what we expected. We didn't expect, a strike to occur. All of those types of things add up to ensuring that we have a flexible and adaptable process to be able to account for those sorts of things. And Erwin, we actually did have a question come in, kind of more or less around the reporting side of things. Really, if there's no real-time data and we have committed budget, how do we communicate that across the organization without constantly reporting and flooding our budget owners with that data constantly? Do you have any insight there, Erwin?
I think that it's a good point, and that's your point number 2 on timeliness and accurate reporting. Is one of the challenges in every role I've been in and every company that I've come into is how do you get the information out faster? When I was interviewing for this position as CFO, in fact, one of the board members said to me, I'm tired of sitting on the train in the caboose looking at where we've been. I want to look at where we're going. I want to be up at the front of the train, not at the back. And it's important that we are the gatekeepers of the history and do report that. But how many of you read the Sunday Times, whether it's online or in the newspaper or physical paper, on Tuesday or Wednesday after it's Sunday? I mean, for me, it's like I got my Sunday paper, I've got my coffee, my bagel. It's kind of my routine Sunday morning. But if I'm out of town and I come back, let's say Monday, and the Sunday paper sitting there in the driveway, it goes straight into the recycle bin. It's old news. It's not relevant anymore. And we are in such a world where everything is real time and constant text and instant information, that outdated stuff is really useless. So it's imperative that we come up with ways to report as quickly as possible. And sometimes you give up some accuracy in order to be more relevant and timely. So you got to be materially accurate instead of down to the penny kind of accurate. And we have a tendency, some of us, to just kind of spin trying to reconcile down to that last cent, when really maybe we should be looking at a dollar instead of a penny. So I think back to that question, how do we provide information when it's not there? There's always information there. What you have to figure out is, what's the right level? Can you give a 20,000 foot overview, and will that suffice in a situation, as opposed to getting down to that ground level, which might take an extra 3 weeks? If you have a board meeting coming up tomorrow, then you certainly can't send out the materials to that board the day after tomorrow. You should be sending it out several days in advance so they have a chance to prepare. And if it's taking you right up till the last second, then you got to look at that process. It's a challenge we all struggle with. And again, I think one of the solutions is you have to set yourself at the right level, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet. What makes the most sense? And don't be afraid to make mistakes. At least if you're putting something out there, you can always put some framework around it and say, this is an estimate. This is based on the first 3 weeks of data, and the fourth week is assumed based on information that we have, but this is kind of where we're at. You can always adjust the difference later. That's one tool that might be within your arsenal, is to make an estimate of the pieces that aren't quite finished yet. But if you're in the ballpark, oftentimes that's a much better solution, to give something than to give nothing until it's actually reconciled down to the penny, and then it's so old that you can't act on it.
That resonates with me so much, Erwin. I can't tell you how many times as a young FP&A financial analyst where I was meticulously trying to find every little penny that I could possibly find to make sure that everything was completely complete and accurate, and that took so much time. I mean, really wasted a lot of time and slowed down a lot of the reporting that was reaching my stakeholders that relied upon that information. Kind of as I alluded to at the opening of the call, I mean, I wasn't getting reports out until 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th day of the following month after our close cycle, which is the caboose example to Erwin that he was alluding to earlier. We don't want, the more that we can provide this information to them, the sooner that they can get it, the more that we can alleviate potential problems from occurring. My example earlier, doubling down on that software budget because they thought they had $11,000 left, etc. So that's extremely relevant and some amazing insights. And we have plenty of time. And another question came in from Tara. If Erwin, you as a CFO, could you share some ways that you've facilitated good communication and collaboration among various stakeholders?
Sure. One of the ways is depending on where you are in the organization. I mean, everybody's got a boss, whether your boss is the CEO or it's the director or the controller, just depending on your level. But one of the ways you can make a difference is to speak to the next level up or levels up and say, listen, I want to be more collaborative and I want to have communication. So I spoke earlier about being part of the organization, not apart from the organization. So when I got here to Blue, for example, we created a senior management team with the the head of marketing, the head of sales, the head of finance, the head of product, the head of development, the head of engineering. And we made like this Knights of the Round Table kind of meeting. And the CEO said, I don't have time for that. You guys have your meeting and then let me know what you came up with. And so we made our own meeting once every 2 weeks where all the other, direct reports of the CEO got together and shared what was going on and how the impacts were within the different parts of the organization. And so we created a council, if you will, where we can openly communicate. When I was at Warner Brothers working on a project, I did a similar thing. I gathered together a meeting on my own initiation of people from different areas in the company who were involved in this project we were doing so that we would have an open dialogue about it. And then I could get information that would be useful to me to putting my reports and my forecasts together, and they were able to get information and let me know what it is that they needed on the financial side in order to give them the data that they needed in order to be more successful on their end. So again, one of the short answers, one of the best ways to do it is involve other people, find out who your stakeholders are, speak to them, get them in with you and make those relationships. And it goes beyond just work. Water cooler discussion is not so much a thing anymore with a lot of remote work, but instead of just slacking somebody or just texting somebody, do that face to face, even if it's a check-in, establish those relationships and have communications, not only about the numbers, but also about what's going on. Ask questions, don't just wait for them to ask you questions is another way to address it. And Chris, you say 7 or 8 days is a long time. I think a lot of us probably get to companies where it's 2, 3, 4 weeks from month end before we're reporting. If we can get to a 3 to 5 day close, that's amazing. That's a great objective, and it really should be everybody's objective to do that. When I worked at Sony, one of the ways that we were able to accomplish that is we actually cut off the books at the end of the 3rd week of the month. So we were doing the last week of the prior month plus 3 weeks of the current month. So we still got a full month, but that way we were able to produce reports by the 1st of the month. Now, some things you can't do, like you can't have a bank reconciliation through the end of the month. If you're cutting off on the 25th, you can't obviously reconcile your bank until you get to the 1st. But there are ways around that. And if you have still a full month of expenses and a full month of revenue, even if it's 3 + 1, you're still getting that information, but at least it's getting there faster. And so it's the illusion, anyway, I mean, it's real, but it gives the illusion that it's for the month, but it's really a month. It's just not a calendar month. So there's little things like that you can implement that might help.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love the kind of, Knights of the Round Table, chiefs of staff kind of example, right? Having everyone having a seat at the table, communicating and collaborating with each other so that every voice is heard and we can make sure that all of those potential, scenarios are accounted for. So I love that. And that's really a good segue, in fact, into the last discussion point for today is, all right, we talked about a lot of these challenges and pitfalls, but how do we solution those? How do we implement some best practices? And I know Erwin has already alluded to a lot of those that have really, could help us a bunch in our day-to-days. And so just kind of a couple talking points from this slide. I know we could talk about this for days. But whenever we threw some of this on the slide, that assigning clear responsibilities really jumped off the page to me. So I'm a football guy. I spent a lot of time in playing football in my past. And so that whole team aspect of things really, really resonates with me. And so the analogy always comes to mind, a quarterback can't make a pass if the offensive line doesn't block, right? So thinking of, the FP&A, the finance team being the offensive line, doing the blocking and tackling to make sure that we are, getting that information, gathering the information in the Knights of the Round Table example that Erwin was talking about, making sure that we're being innovative in the ways that we can prepare these reports sooner, like Erwin was talking about, so that we can not be that caboose example anymore and not be the no police anymore. We want to be a part of that team so that we can all work as one to reach a common goal as an organization. So by empowering those budget owners with the right information so that they can make timely and accurate decisions. Really, at the end of the day, putting that accountability in the hands of our budget owners, right? This allows for us to really replicate ourselves and scale ourselves so that we no longer have to handhold or babysit each and every one of these processes individually, because obviously that doesn't scale. I mean, as a financial analyst, I was managing multiple P&Ls and multiple lines of the business, and it just wasn't scalable to do those types of things. So if we can duplicate ourselves and make these, allow for that accountability to fall on the shoulders of our budget owners, it makes this a much more cohesive process. So certainly one thing that really jumped out to me, obviously we've spoken a lot about these collaborative teamwork capabilities, educating the other stakeholders in the organization so that they can, certainly be, a valuable seat at the table and understand what it is that we're talking about. That I keep alluding to that cash versus expense example, and Erwin took it into great detail. That's a prime example of even how difficult it can be for board members to understand a lot of these functionality, let alone stakeholders that, we're working with that, in the business that don't have any accounting experience at all. So there's a lot of these solutions and best practices that we can facilitate. So kind of curious a little bit. I know you've already spoken a lot and we're running a little short on time, Erwin, but any high level points you'd like to kind of to mention on top of what we've already talked about a little bit thus far today?
So I want to go back to that clear responsibilities again. You're on point, Chris, in that it should not be a finance budget. It's a budget that finance helped put together. And so the budget owners, the stakeholders, have to have that data in their hand. They need to own it. They need to understand it. So let's talk about revenues as an example. I've got my chief revenue officer who's putting together projections of what the customer revenues are going to be. As a finance professional, you need to have your professional skepticism. You need to look at the analytics. You need to give them feedback. But at the end of the day, we finance don't own the revenue budget. We report on it. We can challenge it. We can try to make it be better. We can poke holes in it, try to figure out where it is. And of course, we can track on what the actuals are against what's in there and then ask for what the stories are behind the variances so that we can reforecast it. But we don't get commission. We don't get paid based on the sales. That's a sales team to do it. So you've got to get them that information. So if you say at the end of the month, hey, we said we were going to do 2 million of revenue and it only came in at 1.5 million, and they go, no, we've been really busy. Then you're into a whole discussion of what's revenue recognition versus what work was actually done and is committed. So you've got to find a way to be able to report that data in a way that they can understand. And that goes back to what we said before. There are multiple ways to answer the question, what's 2 + 2? So you got to say 2 + 2 = 4 for an accrual basis. It equals 5 in terms of what's already been committed. It equals 7 in terms of what's being worked on in process that ultimately we figure out is going to be completed by the end of March. You have to understand what it is that they're looking for and be able to communicate it and report on it in a way that they can understand it and recognize that your stakeholders are different. What you present to the board, how you present it, how it looks to the board is different, most likely, than what comes out of NetSuite or SAP or whatever or QuickBooks, whatever your system is. Those are accountancy kind of reports. So you want presentation style reports. If you're dealing with an ops person, maybe they understand bar charts and pie graphs better than a wall of numbers, whereas maybe a finance person or an investor understands spreadsheets better. So you need to understand the way that the target audience is looking for it, and then make sure that you're collaborating with all of those stakeholders to find out what their needs are, how they can best understand it, and then communicate it in a way that you can then adjust your numbers as well as give them those tools that they need in order to be successful at doing what they do, which can then give you more information and more numbers that you can then process, and the cycle repeats itself.
Love that. Love that. Yeah. I mean, like what an amazing way to conclude, a lot of the talking points and the solutions and the best practices for today as it relates to ensuring that at the end of the day, we are, that night at the round table and we're all collaborating with one another to not be the owner of this budget, but we are a team member in ensuring that we operationalize this for our organization so that we can perform the best that we can as one team and reach those goals with one another, right? So I think that lastly, we'll go ahead and segue a little bit into an example, right? Pam's budget module is certainly an area where I have had plenty of experience working with a lot of our prospects and ensuring that by leveraging that functionality, they have the real-time visibility into how these requests to spend money are actually going to impact the budget that they own, ensuring that they have a comprehensive spend overview, really empowering these folks to have real-time visibility into what, where, how, and when a certain request is actually going to impact what it is that they own from a budget perspective. So I want to take a couple of seconds just to kind of give you a glimpse into that budget module as an example, as a best practice, and how a software can really help streamline these types of processes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and present my screen really quickly and show you a brief example of what I have prepared from our budget module. And so in doing so here, I'm going to present my slide. If you bear with me for 2 seconds. I've got it here.
Hey, Chris. So there you go. Perfect.
Yeah. Is it sharing? Or is
no, that's perfect. Bring that last one back up. It was working on the last one. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, there we go. So with Pam, we have a very robust request functionality that would actually empower the organization to have a centralized space to request dollars for spend. And so what we're looking at here is a result of an employee having generated a request, as we can see here, for a yearly PO for $3,500 of software. Well, obviously, it's going to provide me with the approval workflow that needs to occur in order for that spend to be approved. And this is the view that those budget owners can be presented with to have that real budget impact of how that $3,500 fits within their, in this specific example, software license budgeted spend. So it breaks that spend into not just simply what has been spent versus what is available, but it's going to break it down into a couple of additional components that give us that full picture that we kind of talked about earlier in our conversation about that dollar amount that we have committed, that we know will be spent. Like we've allocated dollars to a purchase order. We know those dollars will be spent. They are no longer available. We've allocated a budget to a credit card to be spent, etc. So giving us that visibility is yet another data point that we can present to them in real time to make an informed decision. And as well as maybe as important or even more importantly, I can say specifically from experience, managing all of those incoming requests coming from Jira requests, emails, water cooler conversations, I mean, you name it. Without having a centralized space, it's extremely difficult for us to prioritize how we approve all of these in-process requests. So Pam has the ability to be able to do processes and functionality like that to empower those budget reviewers, the C-suite, et cetera, real-time visibility into that budget so that we can create a culture of accountability and ensuring that all of those stakeholders have an operationalized budget so that they can make those decisions in real time. So I'll stop with that really quickly, and I'm going to go back to my slides here really quickly. I'll stop that. And I hope that was super helpful. And I wanted to go ahead and with the 6 or so minutes that we have left, certainly give us enough time for any sort of question that we might have from the audience. Certainly feel free to use the comment feature on the right-hand side. And while we do so, I will actually leave you with a quick little summary slide here of a handful of bullet points that really are good takeaways from the conversation today. And I really want to thank all of you for your time. This was really helpful, really insightful. I keep learning things from Erwin, so I really appreciate your time, Erwin. Full of so much knowledge, and I really appreciate it, everyone. So yeah, we'll go ahead and pause for a second and see if there are any questions.
While we're waiting for those questions, one thought I'd like to leave you with is it's the same as if any of you are parents. If there's no consequences to an action, then you're not going to get the desired result. And the same thing applies at work. If you have a budget and the stakeholder does not adhere to it, they don't care. It's just something that somebody created for them, and they're going to do whatever they want, spend whatever they want, ignore the numbers or not even look at it. You're not going to have any kind of controls in place. You're not going to be able to manage effectively. And they're not ultimately going to manage effectively, which is going to impact your company. So it's important that the reporting does go out in a way that is meaningful to the stakeholders. Otherwise, you're just not going to get any kind of buy-in. And if there's no consequences of, like, for example, they only have this amount to spend and now they can't go out and spend anymore once they exceed that, or they don't follow the processes of getting the right approvals or collaborating, if there's no consequences, you're not going to get any kind of success that you need. So do try to put those into place, whether you manage up, manage down, manage sideways. If you're going to have a budget and a forecast, you've got to have buy-in, and then there have to be consequences if things do not get to the point that you had predicted they were going to be.
I love the parenting analogy. I'm in the thick of it. I have a 6 and a 4-year-old, so this certainly resonates. But there's a question from Michelle. I'd like to say, I forgot to mention, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Erwin if you have any questions. We have our contact information in the webinar, LinkedIn, email, and as well, we can certainly get you in touch with some folks at the, please feel free to check out the PAM website for some of that additional content on the PAM platform as well. And I think with last few minutes left, we have another question that came in from David that I'll pass this on to Erwin. I think your knowledge far exceeds mine, so I want to pass this to you. But do you feel that it's worth to re-budget during the year, or maybe halfway through, or do you think forecasting is enough? I think it's a really good, relevant question.
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate what I said before. A budget is a set of assumptions as of a certain point of time, and it's useless by the time the ink dries on the page. So forecasting is absolutely critical. What a lot of companies do, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, a volunteer organization, or where you're working at, you need to periodically update the data and look forward, not just look back. But if you just stick to whatever that budget was, SHIT happens. And that's just the nature of life. And you need to be flexible and move forward. I think that the best practice you find out there is continuous reforecasting. Like Chris had mentioned, a 12-month rolling forecast. Sometimes that's really not practical because of staffing limitations. So a quarterly update. The most important thing, I think, is that your material variances are always updated. Any material change and materiality varies depending on the size of your company, but material changes need to happen and need to be communicated and built into your updated forecast, whether that's on the revenue side or the expense side, the staffing side. But you need to be relevant, and you can't be relevant on data that was created a year ago.
Couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate it. And I want to say certainly thank you again, everyone, for your time today. I hope this was very valuable. I hope you got a few nuggets that you could take away from this to kind of incorporate into your day-to-day. I know I certainly have. So thank you for your time today, and we'll go ahead and sign out. I appreciate it.
Yeah, everyone. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Erwin, and all of our attendees today. And here's just a quick reminder on how you can earn your CPE for this webinar.
Today's webinar has ended. We hope you enjoyed it. To earn CPE for watching, download the free Earmark app. Scan the QR code on the screen to visit the download page. Open the app and create your account. Use a valid email address where you will receive CPE certificates. Then register for the course. You can search for it by tapping on the magnifying glass icon on the home screen and then entering the name of this webinar. If you're attending the live stream of this webinar, keep an eye out for an email letting you know when the quiz is available in the next few days. Pass the quiz to earn your CPE credits, then tap the button to email yourself a CPE certificate. Stay tuned for more webinars from Earmark. We appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.